Dollar-risk refugee fraud exposed? Poilievre SHREDS narrative Canadians were never meant to hear. A controversial claim has circulated across social media and alternative news platforms that refugees arriving in Canada can receive as much as $82,000 per year in government benefits without doing any work. The figure, drawn from calculations involving daily allowances for housing and food support, has ignited outrage among Canadians struggling with the cost of living. The supposed breakdown includes $140 per day for accommodation and $84 for food, adding up to a tax-free total that allegedly exceeds what most full-time Canadian workers earn annually. Whether the number holds up under scrutiny or not, the emotional impact has been substantial. What's important to clarify is that this figure is significantly exaggerated. Government support for refugees exists, yes, but it is temporary and conditional. Typical refugee claimants are provided with initial financial assistance as they wait for their applications to be processed, but nowhere near the level of $82,000 a year. These supports usually last only until individuals are expected to secure employment or become eligible for provincial assistance programs. Still, the perception persists that newcomers are treated better than longtime taxpayers. It's a perception that has become fuel for political debate, particularly in the wake of Canada's recent snap federal election. Since April 28, when Canadians went to the polls in an unexpected vote called by new Liberal leader and Prime Minister Mark Carney, immigration has returned to the forefront of national politics. Carney, replacing former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, campaigned on a message of stability, competence, and global cooperation. However, under his watch, the number of asylum claims and temporary resident entries continued to rise, adding to the perception that the Liberal government had lost control of immigration. Facing pressure, Carney introduced a set of reforms that both attempted to reduce temporary resident levels and tighten control at the border. On the other side, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has made immigration integrity a central campaign issue. He frequently highlights videos and testimonials, including the viral refugee benefit claims, to argue that Canada's generosity is being taken advantage of. Poilievre insists that the system is broken, not because immigration itself is bad, but because the scale and pace have outstripped Canada's ability to support new arrivals without harming existing residents. His policy proposals include linking immigration targets directly to housing availability and job market needs, restoring visa requirements for some high-risk countries, and aggressively removing failed asylum claimants. At the heart of this debate lies an even deeper frustration. Many Canadians feel that their voices are being ignored while governments appear more concerned with projecting compassion and virtue than addressing real-world consequences. There's a growing sentiment that reconciliation, equity, and inclusion are being reduced to branding exercises, where meaningful outcomes, like affordability, service access, and cultural preservation, are sidelined. This is particularly felt in Indigenous communities, where population growth through immigration often overshadows long-standing calls for housing, healthcare, education, and land rights for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. This disconnect was symbolized most recently by government announcements to rename certain streets in major cities in recognition of Indigenous heritage. While such moves are framed as meaningful steps in reconciliation, critics see them as empty gestures, public relations wins that do nothing to reverse decades of systemic inequality. Meanwhile, these same communities watch as tens of thousands of newcomers are fast-tracked into the country with promises of support, while Indigenous populations remain chronically underfunded, underhoused, and underrepresented. The juxtaposition is hard to ignore and increasingly harder to defend. Adding to public unease are legislative efforts like the newly tabled Strong Borders Act, which dramatically expands government authority over immigration enforcement. This bill introduces new powers to cancel temporary visas, restrict asylum claims based on route of entry, and limit access to legal hearings in some cases. While supporters argue it restores balance to a system overwhelmed by bad faith claims and outdated policies, critics worry it undermines due process and human rights. The tension between compassion and control is playing out in real time, with lawmakers on both sides clashing over the soul of Canadian immigration. Beyond policy, the tone of the national conversation has shifted. More Canadians, particularly working-class families, are expressing concern that their tax dollars are being misused or stretched too thin. Stories of people unable to find family doctors, afford groceries, or buy homes are now being contrasted with tales of refugees receiving full support packages. While many of these comparisons are unfair or based on partial truths, the emotion behind them is genuine. The sense of imbalance is fueling resentment, and political leaders know it. Poilievre has tapped into this sentiment by framing himself as the candidate of common sense and financial fairness. He argues that Canada must take care of its citizens first and restore integrity to the systems that newcomers depend on. He acknowledges the value of immigration, but insists it must be sustainable and tied to merit. His message: Canadians are generous, but not gullible. The country's openness must not be abused, and accountability must return to the immigration system. Carney, meanwhile, walks a fine line. As a former central banker with international credentials, he emphasizes compassion and global responsibility. But the realities of governance, housing shortages, strained healthcare systems, and declining affordability have forced him to reconsider earlier liberal stances. His pivot toward controlled growth, tighter border screening, and reduced temporary permits signals a recognition that even progressive immigration policy must be bounded by national capacity. As the summer parliamentary recess begins, frustrations remain high. Parliament sat for just 20 days in the first half of the year, with many feeling that critical issues like housing, inflation, crime, and immigration were not properly addressed. Voters are growing weary of slogans and photo ops. They want solutions, and fast. Whether through Carney's calculated moderation or Poilievre's populist drive, the demand for immigration reform has become impossible to ignore. This debate is no longer about numbers alone. It's about national identity, economic justice, and trust. Canadians are asking, who is this country built for? When services fail, when costs soar, and when narratives don't match reality, skepticism grows. And while misinformation should always be corrected, dismissing people's concerns outright only deepens division. The refugee benefits debate, whether exaggerated or not, is now a symbol of a broader demand for truth, accountability, and policies that prioritize citizens without sacrificing humanity.